Today's show, I am joined by Danny Nokes from 106.7 The Fan. It's the Beltway Series, the series that we all love. And Danny Nokes used to be a Baltimore Orioles fan, but made the transition into being a Nationals fan. How hard was that for him, but also you, wherever you are listening? We'll talk about that right after this.
You are Locked On Nationals, your daily Washington Nationals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And thank you for making Locked On Nationals your first listen every day, as we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Ryan Clary, and we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you get your team every single day. And before we get to Danny Nokes from 106.7 The Fan, let me tell you guys about today's sponsor from HelloFresh. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Go to HelloFresh.com/MLB60 and use code MLB60 for 60% off plus free shipping. And now we get into it with Danny Nokes from 106.7 The Fan, as we are talking about a Beltway series. Danny Nokes, my friend, how are you?
I'm doing good, buddy. It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me back. I am a big fan of the Beltway series, as it is a mashing together of the two teams that I have spent my baseball life rooting for at different points. And I can't wait to talk about the transition of how exactly that happened here over the next couple minutes.
Yeah, you led the witness there. And I was about 5 years old when the Nationals moved here. So I can't really say that I was an Orioles fan before. I was a Nationals fan at 5 years old, I guess. But again, can you really be a fan when you're 5 years old and you're still in diapers? Like, okay.
Right.
But you were 12 years old when the Nationals came here to DC. So you had those years in your youth to where you watched the Orioles, you watched Cal Ripken, you watched all those different guys. And so how was that transition like when a team moved from Montreal here to Washington, DC? You grew up an Orioles fan, and now you have a team in your hometown. What was little Danny Nokes thinking back then?
Dude, it was an interesting time to be a baseball fan, because as a DC sports fan, right, we had the Caps, we had the Wizards, who had not long removed from that, rebranded from the Bullets. And then you had the Redskins, and it was always a Redskins town at that point. Everybody that's either grown up in and around the DMV and has lived here at any point over the last 30, 40, 50 years knows that it's always been a football town. Now that's changing, obviously, with everything that's happened both on and off the field for the football franchise, and some good things finally starting to roll forward for them. Yeah, the ownership change that may or may not be imminent, although it sounds like it's imminent, which is great news for them. But what's interesting about, I think, being a DC fan in that time was there was no baseball team. So I know that I'm not alone in having been a fan of the Baltimore Orioles. Now, my dad didn't go to a big college. He only has an associate's degree. He's managed to be pretty successful for himself, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. But a fan of the Maryland Terrapins for most of his upbringing. We kind of had a little bit of fandom within the state of Maryland already in that regard. So having grown up watching Cal Ripken Jr., he was and always will be my absolute all-time favorite baseball player until a national decides to take that over. But I can remember being able to watch him play when I was a kid, and how special that was, and watching him break Lou Gehrig's streak on TV. There was a lot of really cool moments there that definitely impact a young kid as he's watching that baseball team while he's growing up. Now, like you said, I was 12 when the Nats came to town, and I remember Christmas 2004 was when we got our first Nats gear.
Nice.
Santa Claus brought our first Nationals t-shirts, got for me and my brothers. And that was kind of where it all started. And although I felt like it was weird knowing that we were going to start rooting for a different team, and it's not like Dad ever said, we're not Orioles fans anymore. We're Nationals fans now. There was no speech or anything like that happened. It was just going to be a natural and gradual progression into becoming a Nats fan, because at the heart of who we are is DC sports fans, right? My dad grew up in Falls Church and never left Northern Virginia. They still live in Chantilly, Virginia, and have for my entire life, which is approaching 30 years this July. So when the Nats came to town, it was a little bit difficult because they were bad. Now, the first season, they actually got out to a really great start and completely faltered down the backstretch. And for that first season, 2005, it was actually pretty exciting because they finished right around 500. But obviously, they didn't win their first division title until 2012, which was the first year that they went to the playoffs. And a lot of people think that team was good enough to win a World Series. And I'll never forget or forgive Drew Storen. It's burned into every... I wasn't watching it. I was listening to it because at that time in 2012, I was a sophomore at Virginia Tech, and we did not have Masson or cable at all. And this was a playoff game, so it wasn't even on Masson. So we didn't have cable, couldn't watch the game. I was listening to it on ESPN radio. And I remember that and it falling apart, and it was not a whole lot of fun. But at the core of who I am is a DC sports fan. So it always made sense. But I'll say this. I do still have a soft spot in my heart for the Orioles, not their ownership. He's one of the worst owners in sports, right up there with Dan Snyder. I think if it weren't for a World Series, we'd probably be talking about the Lerners entering that conversation as well, because they've squandered more talent than pretty much any baseball franchise. That's for sure. But Camden Yards is a palace, and just a bastion of nostalgia. And it's funny. I was reading about it too recently, because it was in the early 90s that it opened, and it was a part of that sort of fad where new ballparks were opening that were made to look a little bit more retro and just kind of harken back to that nostalgia. So Camden Yards is one of the best ballparks in Major League Baseball. Nats Park is home, and I love Nats Park, and it's an amazing experience, whether you're a home fan, you're rooting for the Nats, or you're a visiting fan rooting for somebody else. I love Nats Park. I love how easy it is to get to. I love having watched the area, the Navy Yard around Nats Park be built up. And there's just all sorts of fun things to do around there. It's really great now, and it's also a great place to watch a game. So I love when these two teams meet every year. It's a lot of fun.
I love it too. And here's the thing about that, Danny. You know, you started my wheelhouse. I love talking stadiums, so I really want to talk about Camden Yards. But let me just say this for Nationals fans. I love Nationals Park as well. I think Nationals Park is severely underrated when talking about some of the game's better ballparks. I've been to a few. I've been to PNC. I've been to Camden. I've been to Fenway. And obviously Nationals Park doesn't really stack up to those, because those are the top three in my mind. But they aren't that far away. And again, but looking at Camden takes the trophy over Nationals Park, and it's not even close. And it's not because Nationals Park is bad. It's just because Camden is that nice. But Danny, I do want to get like kind of your parents' perspective from this, because there are some older people that listen to this podcast, and I'm not calling you guys out, not calling you old or anything. I'm 23 years old. I'm a young idiot. Buck. Here's the thing, or a young buck is a nicer way to put myself. But there are a lot of people who grew up for 30, 40, 50 years with the Baltimore Orioles. So how was it like for your parents, or for your mother and father? What was it like for, I just said parents and mother and father, like, oh my God. What was it like for them to make that transition? Was it a little bit harder, would you say, just because of what they grew up with?
No, it was not hard. In fact, my dad is where I get my love for sports. It's where I get a lot of my gift of gab, right? It's where I got my love for sports talk. He's who introduced me to the Junkies at a very young age, probably too young an age.
Same.
But my dad, if for anybody out there who's listening and that might know him, he's famous for his rants, so especially his sports related rants. And there's nothing like a good old fashioned Redskins rant, because those are always the best. But he gave some good Baltimore Orioles rants, and as more time passed, he just got really sick of having to drive to Baltimore to watch a Major League Baseball game. So honestly, he had the easiest time of any of us moving on from Baltimore. I'm the only one that really didn't move on per se. I'm looking at a Cal Ripken poster and a Cal Ripken pennant sitting on the wall in front of me right now. I'm not joking you. I'd spin my camera if it weren't plugged into the wall right now. But it wasn't hard for them. It wasn't that it was hard for me. It was more of just shifting focus. But you want to talk about ballparks too. PNC is one of people's destinations that they want to go to because it's just so nice, right? It's definitely near the top of my list. I've been to Dodger Stadium. Could not believe how old it was. You know, on TV, it doesn't look quite that old, but it's, you know, right up there with Fenway and Wrigley as one of the older venues in Major League Baseball.
It's a historical establishment at this point. It's
cool.
like a museum in itself, kind of like I was going to say Figley. That's one of my friend's last name. Wrigley and Fenway, and I just married those
combined them.
This has been a disaster start for me, Danny. So
dude. Hey, and the last one that
tough.
the one, so the last one that I went to last year was Petco Park, San Diego, home of the Padres. That lives up to the hype. That's a great ballpark. San Diego is a very cool city in general.
Very cool.
Of course it is. It's just a beautiful place to go. The weather there is some of the nicest in the country. But Petco was near the top, if not my top. And it definitely lived up to the hype. And what's funny, it was in June of last year. So we were about a month away from Juan Soto getting traded out there. And I was also at Juan's second to last game at Nats Park, I want to say a month later in July. And I was wearing my Juan Soto jersey that'll never see Nats Park again. It'll never see Nats Park again.
All right. Well, Danny, we talked about the Beltway Series and the Orioles and the Nationals connection. Real quick, just to one off this. Do you think that Orioles fans hate the Nationals fans still? Like, that was a thing at one point. We do have to move on to the commercial break, but well, actually, I'm going to leave that cliffhanger there. We're going to get to that after this because I do want to hear that a lot of people hate Nationals fans up in Baltimore. You used to be an Orioles fan, so I want to hear that take on it. But before we get into that, I got to tell you guys about our new sponsor, So Rare. And So Rare is a revolutionary fantasy baseball game and marketplace transforming fans and owners with officially licensed digital cards featuring players from across all 30 MLB teams. Unlike other fantasy baseball platforms, So Rare managers truly own their fantasy experience, collecting, buying, selling, and competing with player cards against global opponents to win epic rewards. Win or lose, you still own your cards, and there's no cost to play. Guys, also, just a little fun note to this. You have guys like Juan Soto and Julio Rodriguez who have partnered with So Rare to this event, and it is the coolest thing knowing that we have an old friend with Juan Soto in this. But guys, here's the big requirement. Head to sorare.com/lockedon. That's spelled SORARE.com to draft your team of free player cards, set your lineup, and start competing today to win epic rewards. Again, that's sorare.com/lockedon to start playing today. And now we get back into it with Danny Nokes. And we left a little cliffhanger there, Danny. So do Orioles fans hate Nationals fans?
Well, I have to be careful here not to paint with too broad a brush, right? Because I feel like whenever we have these conversations about fan bases, whatever sport that it is, you start to generalize, and then folks from the fan base that you're talking about get offended because they're not the way that you describe these other people in the fan base. But I'll say this. I have seen some pointed comments by Orioles fans at Nationals fans over the last several years. And they're generally in the vein of something like, I remember when you used to be an Orioles fan, right? That's the perfect descriptor of me and many like me who did not have a team to root for in Washington, D.C. from the time I was born in 1993 till in 2005 before the Nationals got here. So from that perspective, yeah, there are definitely people talking. And I think there are other people too that are just probably a little bit jealous of the Nationals' success that they've had from 2012 to 2019. Obviously, they haven't even gotten a whiff of that success since winning the World Series in 2019. But I feel like Orioles fans probably feel like they've long been due for that. But guess what, O's fans? You got a terrible owner. That's something you and we DC sports fans have in common, not just from the baseball perspective, but from the football perspective. That's for darn
and
sure.
Basketball.
Yep.
And basketball.
That's not going in a much more positive direction, is it? But I'll say this, buddy, because I think this is an important point to make here. A lot of Orioles and Ravens fans are Capitals fans.
True.
And there's no different in you can't say that the two arguments are any different because it's the same thing. If you're a Baltimore sports fan, you like the Ravens, you like the Orioles. Capitals play in DC, even if they used to play in Maryland. That's not how it is anymore, and they're a DC team. So that would be what I would tell any Orioles fan that's salty at that. But it's not something that I see a lot of anymore. So to answer your question, I see some of it every now and then, but not a whole lot. I really don't think there's much there.
And that's true. It's more of the older generation, just because of what they witnessed, the battle from the Angelos and the MLB and trying to stop a team from getting here in Washington, D.C. But that's another topic for another day. I would actually love to go deep in on
That'd
that.
Be fun.
With,
be fun.
That would be a ton of fun. But speaking of fun, Danny, has this 2023 season been a little fun for you to watch for these Washington Nationals?
Well, I can't say that my expectations have seen their results fall beneath them. I don't think they've exceeded them either. I think they're probably right in line with where we expected them to be at this point. And if I'm looking at some of the positive things to take away, I would first start with Mackenzie Gore, who's looked really good in 2 out of his 3 starts, right? He's sort of lived up to the billing so far with only 3 starts under his belt. Obviously, a lot more baseball that needs to be played. And his most recent outing was actually the one that he struggled the most against Cleveland a couple of days ago. But I think you've really seen that from a couple of guys on the staff. Josiah Gray is kind of the same way. He's been pitching much better since getting roughed up early against Atlanta. But I think he's done a nice job of bouncing back there.
Absolutely.
Right before Cade Cavalli's announcement of Tommy John surgery came out, we were doing this show, and we knew that would be something that would be really difficult for the Nationals to overcome this season. And for it to happen right before the start of the season, it couldn't have been worse timing. But
gut punch.
Trevor Williams hasn't been that bad. Cool's been fine. They're not getting a whole lot of run production, and that's really what we expected with both a team that's young and one that just doesn't have a ton of pop in it. I love the start from Victor Robles. He seems like he's kind of turned the clock back a little bit. His average is currently sitting north of 300. How long will that last? We're not sure. And Joey Meneses actually is kind of slow out of the gates this season. But I think that, coming off of the hype from the World Baseball Classic, he just needs to kind of settle back into his rhythm and he'll be fine. But I think all of that is probably right in line with what we were expecting, man.
Exactly. And, a lot of people, I was preaching all off season, listen, the team is telling you what they are by the way they're spending in free agency.
Right.
Corey Dickerson and Trevor Williams being your marquee signings, or Jeimer Candelario, who has actually been really impressive so far. I'm not even going to lie.
Yep.
But they're telling you what they are. They're not ready to compete yet. They're not ready to spend and get that arm. They're not ready to spend and get that Jason Worth. We understand that part of this. But here's the part that I was talking about yesterday, and this is the frustrating part with a rebuilding team, and it's not just us. The Nationals have to take the wins that they can get. We've seen, I believe, up to this point, they've had 6 leads in games that they have blown and have then lost that game.
Yeah.
That part of this, that we're only 2.5 weeks into the season, that is the part where I'm just like, I can't watch that. These at the end of the day, yes, these are young guys.
Yeah.
But you're also a professional baseball player. You still have those expectations to where you go into that bullpen when Davey Martinez chooses Hobie Harris or Kyle Finnegan, whoever it may be, to call in and close that game out. you have to finish the game. And if you don't finish the game, then you're going to hear about it because unfortunately, that's what you get paid to do. You get paid to finish these games. And that has been the frustrating part of this, just because when you have a lead for a team that's not going to have too many leads this year, you got to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and by that metric, buddy, I believe that would make 6 out of their 11 losses, losses in which they actually led in that game, which, you know, we were just talking about how their record's 5-11, which is where we would have probably pegged them at 16 games through this season. But you talk about expectations. Maybe they actually have somewhat played above our expectations, having led in 6 of their 11 losses to go along with the 5 wins that they actually did secure. I'll give them some of the benefit of the doubt there. And I think you're spot on, because they do need to figure out how to finish some of those games. And, you know, their starting pitching is near last in Major League Baseball right now. So I think that they're gonna need to step up there. And one of the biggest caveats to having an above average, at least in this team's perspective, season, was going to be a good pitching rotation. And having already lost Cade Cavalli, they're really starting out behind in that regard. But if they can pick some of that up, some of the guys in their lineup have shown some flashes. You know, Alex Call has made some great plays in the field, and he's come up with a couple of big RBIs in some games as well. Average isn't there yet. You know, it's going to be about finding consistency for so many of these guys. And I feel like for most young players in Major League Baseball, when you play 162 games a season, that's both the hardest and the most important thing to learn as a young player.
That is exactly what it's about. But hey, let's move on. Let's preview this Orioles series real quick. But just before we do that, we got to take a break and hear from our sponsors. We'll get right back to it right after this. And now we get back into it as we are previewing the Baltimore Orioles series against your Washington Nationals. And Danny, tonight is a Josiah Gray day, going on in the bump for his 4th start of this young season. What are your expectations going against a red-hot Baltimore Orioles offense with Josiah Gray?
Yeah, it's no secret. Like you said, they are red hot right now. They definitely have. They're a team, I think, too, that really feeds off of energy and momentum, and because they're a team that's filled with a bunch of young guys too, right? Adley Rutschman, their catcher, is someone that came up last year with as high expectations as certainly any prospect that they've had in recent memory, but probably most prospects across Major League Baseball over the last 5 or so years. He's definitely, I think, been one of the more highly touted prospects, and he has come in he has injected a ton of energy into that lineup, and an important position too as a catcher. So Josiah is going to need to be locked in. You know, like I said, he's been pitching better since getting roughed up a little bit earlier on in the season in that game against the Braves. Yet to get his first win, and his ERA is kind of inflated right now at 4.32, but it's really more of a result of a couple of bad innings, which in baseball, you know, that's the sort of thing that happens. You have to be precise so that those couple of innings don't come back to bite you later in a game. But, you know, so if Josiah goes out and gives them 6 strong innings, they'll have a very good chance to win, as they will or should in most scenarios, if Josiah is trotting out there to spin it for him.
Yeah, exactly. And especially with Josiah Gray, we've talked about some of the issues. Josiah Gray has to stop giving up the long ball. And especially when it comes to left-handed hitters in not the Nationals. The Orioles have Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman, who will be going from the left side of the plate. Danny, you heard this here first. I am guaranteeing a home run from one of those two guys. But I actually have a feeling that tonight the Nationals get a win against the Baltimore Orioles. I believe Josiah Gray shuts the door down on this red-hot Orioles offense. Why not? Why not him? Why not tonight?
And if there's any weakness to this Orioles team right now, it's been what you would probably say their weakness has been for my whole life. Their pitching.
The pitching,
you know what I mean? The pitching is and it's so funny how franchises get stuck in these, cycles where they can't get consistently good starting pitching. The Angels, I feel like, is a great example. Now, yeah, and they have Shohei Ohtani, of course, now who can both pitch and he can play any position that you need him to. But look at all the talent that they've had roll through between Trout, Pujols, Ohtani. That's great. He's not going to be able to keep this up his entire career. As fun and as exciting as it is, there's just no way he's going to have to pick one. The Angels stink again, so figure it out. And Rendon too. I mean, like, they've had a ton of squandered talent.
They stink.
That's just to draw a parallel there, right? Baltimore, I had to remind myself, went to the ALCS in 2014. That's coming up on 9 years ago, which is a good chunk of time. But it always comes down to pitching for them. And we talked about how the Nats have one of the least effective starting rotations in Major League Baseball right now. The Orioles are actually beneath them in that regard. And the Orioles have a much better record right now. Nats 5-11, Baltimore 9-7. So that's if you're gonna find a way to get it done, you can shut that offense down. If your offense wakes up a little bit, you're going to have a chance. There's no doubt about that.
That is what I'm saying. And also, through the first 2.5 weeks of this season, the Nationals at the plate have been a tough team to strike out, and they have faced the Braves. They faced the Rays. Those two, I mean, they have Cy Young contenders all up and down those rosters. And the Nationals actually did decently well. They weren't really producing any runs, but they are tough out. CJ Abrams is a tough out. Luis Garcia is a tough out. And believe it or not, Victor Robles, through the first 2.5 weeks, has been a tough out to get. So the Nationals have been compiling some good at-bats to where I do think they can compete against a very bad Baltimore Orioles staff, especially going against Dean Kramer. I'm sorry, Dean, but I don't know who you are. I'm just being honest.
Yeah. But I'm glad you made the point too about who the Nats played early in the season between Atlanta and Tampa. Tampa, who was on a historic start,
13-0.
Yeah, and that was really cool. And just if anybody out there is not aware of what we're talking about, just Google Tampa Bay Rays start, and it'll put into perspective how rare what they just did is.
Insane.
It's been like 100 years since a team has had that good a start. It was incredible. And then Atlanta, obviously, who, despite the fact that they don't have Dansby Swanson anymore, now they're a couple years removed from the World Series, they're still going to compete. Philadelphia kind of got out to a slower start. I expect them to pick up the pace because there's just no way with that much firepower in their offense that they're just going to be quiet all season long. I don't believe that. But I think that those two teams will be right there at the top of the NL East when it's all said and done. So these, like you said, opportunities don't always present themselves the way that you would hope when you're a team that's far beneath the talent level of who you're lining up against night in and night out. So when an opportunity to beat that team does present itself, you need to jump on it. And this is the scenario going into a couple of games against Baltimore where if you get a lead, you got to shut the door because they're all about that late inning magic, man. Adley Rutschman already has a walk-off home run this season, his first of his career, and that place went nuts. They're going to be playing at Nats Park, so it won't quite be the same, but some of those fans will make the trip down 95, the Beltway 495 to Nats Park. So, man, it's just going to come down. It's just going to come down to making the opportunities count when they present themselves.
And those are great points. It's kind of just been the basis of today's show is that when you are handed something, you better take it and run. Take it and run, literally and figuratively. So, But Danny, I do want to get to this really upsetting news that Zach Brzycky, the former Virginia Tech stud pitcher out of that 2022 MLB draft class, will be shut down due to Tommy John surgery, as Talk Nats over on Twitter got that and broke that news. You covered him over on Virginia Tech. You've seen him pitch in person. So I do want to get your reaction to that, as you've seen a lot from him and you believe in what he can do.
Yeah, and I'm bummed because anyone that has to have Tommy John surgery, obviously, that's quite a big hurdle to clear. Even if it has become more common for players to bounce back from Tommy John surgery, frankly, it feels like you're in the minority if you haven't had Tommy John surgery at some point in your baseball career. I think someone like Max Scherzer, who hasn't had it yet, is an outlier. Pretty much everybody has had it at least once, and we know that well with Strasburg here. But I was bummed for Zach, obviously, because there was so much. I felt like there was not potential to see him in the Nationals lineup this year, but to see him take another major step forward, which he was on a great trajectory development wise towards the end of last year. It really started in the middle of last year. He was very effective in Fredericksburg. He's just a guy that I think is going to steadily progress. He comes from that Virginia Tech program in Blacksburg, coached by John Sheff, that when I was there in 2018 and 2019, right before I left to come to Richmond, they were still trying to build things up. They were more so rebuilding, and they were one of the worst teams in the ACC. Fast forward to last year, and they're hosting a super regional. So he helped turn that program around in a relatively short period of time. And I think he did it with players that are kind of like Zach, who steadily develop throughout their careers. So it's hopefully it's a minor setback for a major comeback. Obviously, we're not going to see him again this season, and that stinks. It stings as well. But I'm hoping that it's happening both early enough in his career that he can recover a little bit better. Maybe his body is able to adjust to that a little bit quicker than if he were to have this sort of surgery in, say, 5 or 10 years, right?
Exactly.
But also, I hope that it doesn't hinder his development, because obviously Tommy John surgery, even if it is more common, is still a major reconstructive surgery to have on your elbow. So
it really
I'm
is.
bummed for him. When I saw the tweet from you and Nat's talk, and I just sat in my chair for a second, and I just exhaled. That was my guy. He was who I brought up on the podcast a couple of weeks ago as someone that I felt like we were going to be able to look at the end of the season and be like, okay, maybe we're ready to see him up in the bigs next year. But who knows, man? Baseball's weird. Baseball is a weird sport.
It sounds like up to this point from the reporting that I've seen that he's expected to make a full recovery, should be back by next year, pitching and doing his thing. So that's always a good sign. It's always a good sign. It's what we want to see. But Danny, it's time for the Beltway Series. The Nationals and the Orioles. It doesn't matter how good the Nationals are or how bad the Nationals are, and same with the Orioles. It's always a fun rivalry. Are you going to be getting out to the ballpark anytime?
I'm not, because it's in the middle of the week, and I gotta venture up to Washington D.C. to make that happen. No, but hopefully I will be able to make it up, potentially to a game in the next couple of weeks. I'm actually coming up this weekend for a friend's 30th birthday party. It's that year. It's that year for all of us, buddy. So when I come up to DC for my 30th in July, I'll let you know where we're all getting hammered at, trying to forget that we just turned 30.
I'll remind you guys that I am still in my Jordan year. So
that's a good year, man. That's a good year to be in.
It's a fun year. I'll say that. All right, Danny, it was always fun catching up with you, man. How can people find you? Tell us where you are, social media, wherever it may be.
Yep. You're looking at my Twitter handle right now, at Danny Nokes, for anybody that's watching us on YouTube right now. I'm on Instagram as well, Danny.Nokes, just a little bit of a difference right there. Don't have any upcoming shows with 106.7 The Fan, but Twitter is the best way to get updates on that. I get them on a week-to-week basis, sort of depends on availability. So just keep an eye out on Twitter, folks. We'll be back at some point soon.
We'll be back. All right, that's Danny Nokes. I'm Ryan Clary from Locked On Nationals, and that'll do it for tonight, guys. Thank you for making Locked On Nationals your first listen every day. Now for tomorrow, we're going to talk about Game 1 of that Baltimore Orioles-Washington Nationals series, and I'll have you covered just like I do every single day here on Locked On Nationals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.